Close your eyes for a second. I want you to imagine waking up, but not in your bed, not in your house, not in any version of the world you've ever known. I want you to imagine opening your eyes in a place where the darkness is real darkness. Not the kind of darkness where you can still see the glow of your phone on the nightstand or the streetlight bleeding through the curtains. I mean actual, total, swallow you whole darkness, broken only by the faintest orange flicker coming from the fireplace across the room. The air smells like wood smoke and something else, salt. You can smell the ocean even from inside, even with the shutters latched tight against the cold. And it is cold. The kind of cold that gets into your bones before you've even fully woken up. You are in Boston. The year is 1723, and your day has already started, whether you like it or not. Now, before we go any further, I want to be honest with you about something. A lot of history gets told in a way that makes the past feel like a museum exhibit. Neat, clean, behind glass, people in old paintings standing very still with very serious expressions. And you look at them and think, okay, sure, that happened, I guess. And then you move on with your life. But that's not what I want to do tonight, because the people who lived in Boston in the 1720s were not museum exhibits. They were people. Complicated, exhausted, funny, grieving, ambitious, scared, hopeful people, just like you and me. And they were just trying to get through their days the same way we are trying to get through ours. The only difference is their days were a lot harder. Boston in 1723 is a town of about 12,000 people, which sounds small until you realize that makes it one of the biggest, most important, most alive cities in all of colonial America. It sits on a little peninsula poking out into Massachusetts Bay. Water on almost every side, and the harbor is everything. The harbor is the lungs of this city. Everything comes in and goes out through the harbor. Food, cloth, news, money, people, trouble. All of it arrives by sea because there is no other way in that makes any real sense. The roads connecting Boston to the rest of Massachusetts are rough, muddy, slow, and honestly kind of miserable even in good weather. The sea is faster, more reliable, and when it isn't trying to kill you, considerably more comfortable. The streets of Boston in 1723 are nothing like what you'd expect if you've only ever seen a modern American city. Forget the grid, forget the neat blocks, the numbered avenues, the logical flow of traffic from one place to another. Boston's streets were not planned, they grew. They followed the paths that cattle made crossing the peninsula generations earlier. They wound around hills and bends, and somebody's barn that was there first and wasn't moving. They change names without warning. They dead-end for no apparent reason. They are narrow enough that two carts passing each other is a negotiation. And they are paved, if you can call it that, with cobblestones that are uneven enough to turn an ankle in daylight and genuinely dangerous in the dark. And the smell. I have to tell you about the smell because it is one of those details that history books always skip, and it is one of the most important things to understand about what it actually felt like to be alive in this city. Boston in 1723 smells like salt water and wood smoke and fresh bread baking somewhere nearby, and horse manure and rotting fish and tallow candles, and underneath everything the particular earthy, damp smell of a city built mostly of wood that gets rained on and snowed on and fogged in for a significant portion of the year. It is not a pleasant smell by modern standards, but to the people who live here, it is simply the smell of home. It is the smell of their city, their life, their morning. Let me introduce you to a woman. Her name is Martha, and she has been awake for at least an hour already, which means she has been awake since well before the sun had any intention of rising. Martha is in her early 30s. She has had several children. She has lost at least one, maybe two, because that is simply the reality of being a mother in 1720s Boston, and she carries that loss the way everyone in her world carries loss, quietly, practically, with a faith that insists there is meaning in it, even when meaning is the hardest thing to find. Right now, Martha is at the hearth. The hearth is the center of this house, the center of almost every house in Boston, in a way that has no real equivalent in modern life. It is where the heat comes from, where the food comes from, where the light comes from in the early morning before the day gets bright enough to see without it. A house in 1720s Boston is essentially built around its chimney, and the woman who manages that hearth is managing something closer to a small industrial operation than what we'd call cooking today. There is no stove with burners you can adjust. There is no oven with a temperature dial. There is fire, and there are iron pots, and there are hooks and cranes and trivets, and there is decades of accumulated skill in knowing how to make all of those things work together to produce a meal. Martha is rebuilding the fire from last night's embers, coaxing it back to life with a patience that comes from doing this every single morning of her adult life. Her breath is visible in the cold air. The keeping room, the main room of the house where the family lives most of its life, has not yet warmed up from the night, and it won't be truly comfortable for another hour at least. She is wearing her day clothes already, because changing into them in a cold room is something you do quickly and without lingering, and she has already fetched water from the well down the street, a walk of several hundred feet in the pre-dawn cold, carrying a heavy wooden bucket, which is not nothing, and she has that water heating now for the morning porridge. Her husband Ezekiel left before she was even fully awake. He is a fisherman, which means his day starts in the dark and ends when the sea decides it ends, and the sounds of him pulling on his boots and latching the door behind him in the cold morning are just part of the rhythm of her life, as familiar and unremarkable as the church bell that is ringing now in the distance, slow and heavy, counting out the hour for a city that is just beginning to stir. 12,000 people, one city, one cold morning in 1723. And this is just the beginning. The porridge that Martha is making this morning is cornmeal. That's it, cornmeal and water, cooked slow over the fire until it thickens into something dense and filling, and honestly, if we're being real, pretty bland. But she'll add a spoonful of molasses if they have it, which they usually do, because molasses is one of the cheapest sweeteners available in Boston right now, and it comes in by the barrel from the Caribbean on ships that make the run so regularly that the docks sometimes smell like a sugar mill on warm days. The molasses makes the porridge bearable. It makes it almost good. And when you've been awake since before dawn and you've already hauled water and rebuilt a fire and you've got a full day of hard physical work ahead of you, almost good is plenty. There might be bread left from 2 days ago, a little stale now, but still solid enough to eat if you don't mind working your jaw. There might be a piece of salt cod that's been soaking overnight in a bowl of water to pull some of the salt out, because salt cod straight from the barrel is so aggressively salty it's almost inedible, and you have to soak it for hours before it becomes something a human being actually wants to put in their mouth. There is no orange juice. There is no coffee waiting in a pot, though coffee is starting to appear in Boston's taverns and coffee houses. It is still a luxury, not a morning staple for a working family. There is small beer, which sounds alarming until you understand that small beer has almost no alcohol in it, maybe 1 or 2%, and the reason people drink it instead of water is genuinely practical. The water in Boston in 1723 is not always safe. The wells are close to the privies. The runoff from the streets gets into everything after a heavy rain, and the connection between contaminated water and stomach illness is something people understand even if they can't explain it in any scientific way. Small beer, having been fermented, is safer. So Martha gives it to her children the same way a modern mother gives her kids a glass of milk, not because she's being reckless, but because she's being careful. When the children come downstairs, the keeping room is warmer, but still not what you'd call comfortable. The oldest is a boy, 9 years old, named Samuel, serious for his age, already reading, already aware that he is expected to be useful, and that childhood in this city is not a long season. The younger ones trail behind him, still soft with sleep, and Martha gets them dressed with the efficient, no-nonsense speed of a woman who has done this in the cold more times than she can count. Dressing children in 1723 Boston is not a quick business. There are no elastic waistbands, no zippers, no Velcro. Everything is linen and wool, fastened with buttons and ties and small hooks that require fingers that are already stiff with cold to work properly. The youngest, barely walking, has to be held still while Martha works, which is its own athletic event, and she does it all without complaint, because complaint is a luxury that her life genuinely cannot afford. Once the children are fed and Samuel is sent off toward the dame school, a small operation run out of a neighbor woman's house a few streets over, where children of both sexes learn the alphabet and basic reading from the New England primer, Martha begins the real work of her day. And here is where I want to slow down for a moment, because the word work in this context means something so physically demanding, so relentlessly full body, that most modern people would struggle to last a single day doing it. It is Monday. Monday is washing day. Washing day is, without exaggeration, the hardest day of the week in a 1720s Boston household. To wash the family's clothes and linens, and everything needs washing regularly because filth and disease are closely connected, and Martha knows it. She has to first heat enormous quantities of water. This means feeding the fire, hanging the largest iron pot on the crane above the hearth, filling it from the water she's already fetched, and then fetching more because one trip to the well is never enough on washing day. While the water heats, she sorts the laundry, the shirts and shifts and stockings and bed linens that have accumulated through the week, and then the actual washing begins. Soaking, scrubbing with lye soap. The lye soap she made herself from wood ash and rendered animal fat, a process that takes its own separate day earlier in the month, and that produces something so caustic it will strip the skin from your hands if you work with it long enough without rinsing. Martha's hands, if you looked closely, are permanently reddened and rough across the knuckles, the mark of a woman who has been doing this for years. After scrubbing comes wringing. Wet wool and wet linen are enormously heavy, and wringing them out by hand, twisting the fabric as hard as you can to force the water out before hanging, requires the kind of sustained physical strength that you build gradually over years, the same way a carpenter builds the specific strength in his forearms or a fisherman builds it in his back. Then hanging, on lines strung across the yard in good weather, across the keeping room itself when it's raining or freezing, which in Boston in the 1720s is a significant portion of the time. And then waiting for everything to dry, which in winter can take the better part of the day, the damp clothes steaming gently in the warmth of the fire and filling the house with the particular smell of wet wool slowly drying, a smell that anyone who grew up in a cold climate before central heating probably recognizes from deep memory. All of this, every bit of it, before noon, every single Monday. Outside the house, Boston is getting on with its day. The market is filling up. Farmers from the countryside around the city have been coming in since before dawn, their carts loaded with whatever the season offers. In winter and early spring, this means root vegetables mostly, the last of what was stored in root cellars since the autumn harvest. Turnips, parsnips, carrots or soft from months of storage, onions, dried beans by the sack. There are barrels of pickled vegetables and crocks of butter and rounds of hard cheese, and there is always salt fish in various forms because Boston is a fishing city, and fish is what keeps this population fed through the lean months when fresh food is scarce and expensive. The market is not just a place to buy food. This is important to understand. In a city with no telephones, no internet, no radio, no television, in a city where the only mass media is a weekly newspaper that most people read days after it's printed, the market is where you find out what's happening. You learn which ship came in last night and what news it's carrying from London. You learn who's sick and who's gotten better and who isn't going to get better. You learn which merchant just went bankrupt and whose daughter just got engaged and what the minister said on Sunday that has people still talking 3 days later. The market is the city's nervous system, and the conversations that happen there, quick, overlapping, constantly updating, are how a community of 12,000 people stays connected to itself. And connection in 1720s Boston is not optional. It is survival. Let's talk about the men for a minute. Specifically, let's talk about Ezekiel, Martha's husband, who has been out on the water since before the sun came up, and who will not be home until the afternoon at the earliest, if the weather holds and the catch is decent and nothing goes wrong, which, in the fishing business around Boston Harbor in 1723, is never quite a guarantee. Ezekiel works on a small open fishing boat called a shallop. It is not a big vessel. It is not a comfortable vessel. It is a practical vessel, low, wide, designed for the relatively sheltered waters of the harbor and the nearby bays, crewed by 2 or 3 men who spend their working hours hauling nets and hand lines in conditions that range from merely uncomfortable to genuinely frightening, depending on what the weather decides to do. The water in Massachusetts Bay is cold year-round. Not cool, cold. The kind of cold that takes your breath away if you put your hand in it. The kind of cold that kills a man who goes overboard in minutes if he isn't pulled back immediately. Every fisherman who works out of Boston Harbor knows this. They know it the way they know their own names, not as an abstract fact, but as a physical reality that lives somewhere in the back of their minds every single moment they are on the water. Ezekiel has been fishing since he was a boy. His father fished, his grandfather fished. The knowledge of the water, where the fish run at which time of year, how to read the color of the sky and the feel of the wind to know what the weather is planning to do in the next few hours, how to handle a boat when a squall comes up faster than you expected. This knowledge is not something he learned from a book. It is something that was handed to him, slowly and physically, over years of going out on the water with men who already knew it, watching and doing, and occasionally making mistakes that were educational rather than fatal, which is the only kind of mistake you get to learn from when you work on the sea. The fish they bring back are mostly cod. Boston cod, New England cod. It is one of the most important food sources in the entire Atlantic world in the 1720s, and that is not an exaggeration. The waters around Massachusetts are extraordinarily rich with it, and the fishermen who work those waters are pulling up something that feeds not just their own city, but a significant portion of the wider Atlantic economy. Dried salt cod from New England ends up on plates in Portugal, in Spain, in the Caribbean islands, in the holds of slave ships provisioning for the Middle Passage. It is everywhere, this humble dried fish, and it is the foundation on which Boston's prosperity is built as much as any merchant's fine imported goods or any ship captain's carefully negotiated trade deal. But Ezekiel sees almost none of that prosperity directly. He earns a modest living. Some years are better than others. In a good year, when the fish are running well and the weather is cooperative and his boat stays sound and nobody gets sick and the market prices hold steady, the family eats adequately and has enough left over to cover their debts at the dry goods shop and maybe put a small amount aside. In a bad year, a winter that comes early and keeps the boats in harbor for weeks, a summer when the fish seem to have disappeared, a season when one of the children gets sick and the doctor has to be called, the margin disappears entirely, and the family is surviving on credit and community goodwill and whatever Martha can produce from her garden and her considerable practical ingenuity. This is the economic reality of working life in 1720s Boston for the majority of its residents. Not poverty, exactly, not the grinding, hopeless destitution that exists at the very bottom of this society, but a kind of permanent, low-level financial precariousness that means there is almost never a cushion, almost never a safety net beyond the community itself, almost never a situation where you can afford to be sick or unlucky for very long without it starting to hurt. The merchants who live in the fine brick houses near the waterfront, the men whose ships fill the harbor and whose counting houses process the trade of the entire Atlantic economy, they are wealthy, genuinely wealthy by the standards of this era. But they are a small minority, and the distance between their lives and the lives of a fisherman and his wife in a wooden house near the docks is almost as vast as the Atlantic Ocean that connects Boston to the wider world. Now, while Ezekiel is on the water, and Martha is managing the washing, and the younger children are underfoot, and Samuel is sitting in the dame school trying to remember his letters, let us walk through the city a little. Because Boston, in the middle of a working morning, is one of the most interesting places in colonial America, and it deserves to be seen clearly.
The sounds hit you first. Boston in 1723 was loud in a very specific, very physical way. Not the electronic roar of a modern city, but something more immediate and more varied. There is hammering. Constant hammering, because the city is always building. New wharves pushing out into the harbor, new houses going up on the edges of the settled area, older buildings being repaired or expanded. There is the rumble of cartwheels on cobblestone, a sound so pervasive and so continuous that the people who live here probably stopped hearing it years ago, the way you stop hearing the hum of your refrigerator. There are voices, vendors calling out their wares, men arguing over the price of something, women calling to each other across the narrow streets. children being told to come here right now and not to touch that. There are the sounds of animals, horses, oxen, pigs being driven to market, chickens in somebody's backyard, the ever-present gulls wheeling overhead and screaming at each other with the aggressive enthusiasm that seagulls have maintained completely unchanged across 300 years. The buildings you're walking past are almost entirely wood. Boston has burned before, badly, repeatedly, and there have been attempts to encourage brick construction, especially after the Great Fire of 1711 that destroyed over 100 buildings in the center of town. But wood is cheaper. Wood is what the forests of New England supply in enormous quantities. Wood is what the carpenters of Boston know how to work with, and so wood is what the city is built from, in these close-packed, steep-roofed, small-windowed structures that line the narrow streets and lean slightly toward each other overhead, as if they are listening to the conversations of the people walking below. The windows are small because glass is expensive. Real glass, flat glass of the quality needed for windows, is mostly imported from England and costs enough that you don't use more of it than you absolutely have to. The ground floors of many buildings along the busier streets are shops, open to the street during business hours, the goods displayed in the windows or laid out on a counter just inside the door, the shopkeeper or his wife visible just inside, ready to engage with anyone who stops to look. There are bakers and butchers and tailors and shoemakers and chandlers selling tandles and barbers who also pull teeth when the need arises, because in 1720s Boston, the same person who cuts your hair is often the same person who handles your dental emergencies, which tells you something important about the state of medical specialization in this era. Walking through this city, you would notice something else, too. Something that might take you a moment to identify, but that once you see it, you cannot unsee. Almost everyone is moving with purpose. There is very little of what we would recognize as leisure happening in the streets of Boston at 10 o'clock on a Monday morning. People are going somewhere, carrying something, doing something. The idea of simply strolling, walking for the pleasure of walking without a destination or an errand, is not really part of the culture here. Time in 1720s Boston is understood as a resource that God has given you and that you are accountable for using well. And the Puritan inheritance of this community, even as it softens and evolves through the early decades of the 18th century, still makes idleness feel not just unproductive, but faintly sinful. There are exceptions to this, of course. There are always exceptions. The boys playing in an alley between two houses, apparently unconcerned about anywhere they need to be. The old man sitting on a wooden bench outside a shop, watching the street with the unhurried attention of someone who has earned the right to simply observe. The sailors fresh off a ship who are making their way up from the waterfront with the slightly dazed, slightly delighted look of men who have been on sea for weeks and are only beginning to remember what it feels like to have solid ground under their feet. These people are the punctuation in the long sentence of the city's working day, the pauses that make the rhythm readable. And underneath it all, underneath the noise and the smell and the movement and the cold morning air, there is something else, something harder to name but unmistakably present, a kind of aliveness, a density of human experience packed into this small peninsula that makes every street corner feel charged with consequence, every conversation potentially significant, every face a whole story that you will never fully know. Boston in 1723 was not a comfortable place. It is not an easy place, but it is, without question, a place where things are happening, where the world is being made slowly and without anyone fully realizing it into something new.
There is a boy working in a print shop on Queen Street right now who is going to change the world. He doesn't know it yet. Nobody knows it yet. He is 17 years old. He is technically running away from his life. And at this particular moment in 1723, he is probably either setting type with ink-stained fingers or arguing with his older brother about something, because arguing with his older brother is more or less his full-time occupation when he isn't setting type. His name is Benjamin Franklin, and the fact that he is here, in this city, on these streets, during exactly the years we are talking about, is one of those historical details that makes the past feel suddenly, startlingly close. Benjamin Franklin came to his brother James's print shop as an apprentice when he was 12 years old. The apprenticeship was a legal arrangement, signed and witnessed, binding for 7 years, that essentially gave James control over Benjamin's life in exchange for teaching him the printing trade. Room, board, clothing, training, that was the deal. And the printing trade in 1720s Boston is a genuinely good trade to know, because Boston is a city that runs on printed words. There are newspapers, pamphlets, broadsides, books, legal documents, religious tracts, an endless appetite for printed material in a community that takes literacy seriously and has opinions about everything, which in Boston in 1723 means absolutely everyone has opinions about everything and is looking for ways to make those opinions known to as many people as possible. James Franklin's paper is called the New England Courant, founded in 1721, and it is one of the liveliest and most controversial publications in the colonies. James is not afraid of a fight. He publishes things that make powerful people uncomfortable, including pointed criticism of the colonial government and, most dramatically, fierce opposition to smallpox inoculation, which is the hottest controversy in Boston during these years. Benjamin, stuck in the shop, watching his brother publish and argue and make enemies and occasionally get himself thrown in jail for something he printed, is absorbing all of this, the mechanics of the trade, yes, but also something more important. He is learning what words can do. He is learning that a well-written argument, printed and distributed widely, can shift the way an entire community thinks about something. He is learning, in other words, the thing that will make him one of the most powerful voices of his generation. But he is also deeply unhappy. Benjamin Franklin is not a person who is built for obedience, and an apprenticeship, especially an apprenticeship to an older brother who has known you your entire life and has a complicated mixture of affection and resentment toward you, is an arrangement that requires a great deal of obedience. He chafes against it constantly. He teaches himself to write by copying essays from The Spectator, a famous English periodical, in secret, deliberately practicing until his style is good enough that he starts submitting letters to his brother's paper under a fake name. The name he chooses is Silence Dogood, Mrs. Silence Dogood, supposedly a middle-aged widow from the countryside with strong opinions and a sharp wit, who starts appearing in the Courant in the spring of 1722 with letters that are so good, so funny, so precisely observed that people all over Boston are talking about who this mysterious woman could possibly be. James Franklin has no idea it's his little brother. When he finds out, he is not pleased. By 1723, Benjamin had had enough. He is going to leave. He is going to break his apprenticeship, which is technically illegal, a breach of contract, and get himself on a ship to New York, and from there make his way to Philadelphia, where nobody knows him and he can start fresh. He does exactly this, and the rest, as they say, is history so famous it barely needs repeating. But right now, in the Boston of our story, he is still here, still ink-stained, still arguing, still 17 and restless, and full of something that the city of Boston is, for all its considerable virtues, slightly too small to contain. The apprenticeship system that shaped Benjamin Franklin's early life is worth understanding more broadly, because it is one of the fundamental structures of 1720s Boston's economy and social organization. Almost every skilled trade in this city is transmitted through apprenticeship: carpentry, blacksmithing, silversmithing, shoemaking, tailoring, rope-making, coopering, baking. A boy of 12 or 13 whose family has decided he is going to learn a trade is placed with an established craftsman, moves into that craftsman's household, and spends the next 7 years learning everything there is to know about that trade from the inside out. The experience varies enormously depending on who the master is. A good master is patient and thorough. He teaches the apprentice not just the physical skills of the work, but the business practices, the customer relationships, the sourcing of materials, the management of tools, all the accumulated practical wisdom that separates a craftsman who merely knows the techniques from one who can actually run a successful operation. A bad master treats his apprentice primarily as a source of cheap labor, gives him the dirty and repetitive jobs, teaches him as little as possible, and sends him out at the end of 7 years, technically qualified, but practically underprepared. There is no quality control on this system, no apprenticeship board that checks in on how the training is going. You get what you get. And what you get depends almost entirely on the character of the man's household you've moved into. The silversmiths of Boston are among the most admired craftsmen in the city, and their shops, small, quiet, filled with the particular concentrated intensity of very precise work, are worth pausing at. The craft of silversmithing in colonial Boston requires a combination of artistic sensibility and technical mastery that is genuinely impressive, and the pieces that come out of the best Boston silver shops, the tankards and teapots and spoons and buckles and porringers, are objects of real beauty, shaped by hand with tools of extraordinary delicacy, from sheets of imported silver that cost enough that a mistake is not just professionally embarrassing, but financially painful. Working in one of these shops right now is a French immigrant named Apollos Rivoire. He came to Boston as a young man, apprenticed with the silversmith John Coney, one of the finest craftsmen in the city, and has built a solid reputation and a modest but reliable business. He has anglicized his name slightly to make it easier for his Boston customers. He goes by Paul Revere now, or sometimes just Revere, because French names are a small barrier to business in a city that is overwhelmingly English in its heritage and its cultural loyalties. He has a family. He has a shop. He has a life that is, by the standards of working Boston in 1723, a good one. Skilled, respected, stable. He also has a son, born in 1734, still more than a decade away, who will carry his name into one of the most famous nights in American history. But that is a different story for a different night. Tonight we are staying in 1723, in the shop on the street, with the silversmith bending over his bench in the window light, his hands moving with the slow, sure confidence of someone who has been doing this long enough that the skill has moved out of his conscious mind and into his fingers, where it lives now as something closer to instinct than thought. This is what craft looks like in 1720s Boston. This is what 7 years of apprenticeship produces when the master is good and the apprentice is willing. Not just a skill, a way of being in the world, a set of hands that know what to do. Let's talk about the taverns, because if you really want to understand what daily life felt like in 1720s Boston, not just what people did, but how they experienced being alive in this city, what they talked about and argued about and laughed about and worried about. You need to spend some time in the taverns. The taverns are where Boston's social life actually happens, and there is no modern equivalent that quite captures what they were, because they were doing something that no single institution does today. They were the bar and the restaurant and the coffee house and the town hall and the post office and the news network all at once, rolled into one smoky, loud, fire-lit room. There were dozens of them scattered across Boston in 1723. Some are grand establishments near the townhouse, the Green Dragon on Union Street, the Bunch of Grapes on King Street, where merchants and lawyers and ship captains conduct business over pewter tankards of ale, and the conversation is as likely to be about the price of molasses futures or the latest political news from London as it is about anything more personal. Some are rough waterfront dram shops where sailors and dock workers crowd in after a day's work and drink hard cider and New England rum, and occasionally settle arguments with their fists in ways that the night watch will have to sort out later. And there is everything in between. Neighborhood taverns where the same dozen men show up every evening and sit in the same chairs they've been sitting in for years, talking about the same things they've always talked about, comfortable in the particular way that only long familiarity can produce. The rum being drunk in these taverns deserves a moment of serious attention, because rum is not just a drink in 1720s Boston. Rum is a window into everything that is complicated and troubling and morally compromised about the world this city is built on. Rum is distilled from molasses. Molasses comes from sugar. Sugar in the 1720s is produced almost entirely on Caribbean plantations, Barbados, Jamaica, Antigua, St. Kitts, in enslaved African men and women working in conditions of almost unimaginable brutality, in tropical heat, in fields of sharp-edged sugarcane, under the oversight of overseers whose authority over their lives is absolute and whose mercy is not guaranteed. Boston is not separate from this system. Boston is inside it, deeply and profitably. The ships that sail out of Boston Harbor carry dried fish and lumber and agricultural products down to the Caribbean, where they are traded for molasses, which comes back to Boston and goes into the city's distilleries. There are several operating in the 1720s, their sweet, sharp smell a regular feature of certain neighborhoods, and comes out as rum, which is then sold locally and exported, some of it back to Africa as part of the purchase price for more enslaved people. This triangular trade connecting New England, the Caribbean, and West Africa is the economic engine underneath Boston's prosperity, and almost everyone in this city benefits from it in some way, whether they acknowledge it or not. There are enslaved people in Boston itself. This is something that surprises people who think of slavery as purely a Southern institution, a historical misconception that the South itself has not exactly worked hard to correct. But Massachusetts has had enslaved people since the earliest years of the colony, and Boston's wealthiest households often include one or two enslaved individuals performing domestic work. The numbers are not large, perhaps 200 or 300 enslaved people in a city of 12,000, and the physical conditions of urban domestic slavery in New England are different from the plantation slavery of the Carolinas or Virginia. But different is not the same as acceptable, and the men and women living in bondage in Boston's fine houses are as fully human, as fully deserving of freedom and dignity as anyone walking the streets of this city as a free person. The question of slavery is beginning, very slowly, very quietly, to trouble some consciences in 1720s Boston. Samuel Sewall, one of the most prominent judges in Massachusetts, published a pamphlet more than 20 years ago now called The Selling of Joseph, arguing from biblical principles that slavery was morally indefensible. It caused a stir. People argued about it for a while, and then they mostly set it aside because the economic interests are enormous and the social disruption of confronting them is frightening, and it is always easier to look away from an injustice that is profitable than from one that costs you nothing. But the argument has been made. The seed is in the ground, and it will grow slowly across the decades and the generations until it becomes the defining moral crisis of the nation that Boston is right now unknowingly helping to build.
But let us come back to the tavern, because there is more happening there than rum and moral compromise. The taverns of Boston are also where politics lives. And the politics of 1720s Boston are, if you pay attention to them, a kind of rehearsal, a first rough draft of everything that is going to happen 50 years from now, when this city becomes the center of a revolution. The fundamental tension in Massachusetts politics in the 1720s is between the colony's elected legislature, the General Court, which the colonists think of as their parliament, their primary governing body, the institution through which they consent to their own governance, and the royal governor appointed by the crown, who represents British interests and who has the power to veto legislation, dissolve the assembly, and generally remind the colonists that they are, in the end, subjects of the King of England and not entirely masters of their own house. This tension has been building for decades. It flares up regularly over specific disputes, taxation, the control of the militia, the payment of the governor's salary, any number of concrete, practical matters, and each flare-up leaves a residue of grievance and suspicion that accumulates slowly in the political culture of the colony, like sediment building up on the bottom of a harbor. The current governor, Samuel Shute, has been having a particularly difficult time of it. He arrived in 1716 with what he probably imagined were reasonable expectations about his authority, and he has spent most of his tenure in a running battle with the General Court that has left both sides exhausted and antagonistic. The court controls the money. It has to approve any expenditure of public funds, and it has used this power with considerable creativity to limit the governor's practical authority even in areas where his formal authority is clear. Shute, for his part, has responded with the kind of rigid insistence on his prerogatives that tends to make colonial politicians dig in harder rather than back down. By 1723, the situation is tense enough that Shute is going to leave the colony within the year, sailing back to England to complain to the Crown about the ungovernability of Massachusetts, leaving behind a political situation that is unresolved and a colonial population that has learned something important about how much they can resist when they are determined to. In the taverns, men argue about all of this. They argue about the governor and the general court and paper money and the price of firewood and whether the minister's sermon last Sunday was too long, which it almost certainly was, because the ministers of 1720s Boston are not known for their brevity, and what the latest ship from London says about the political situation there, and whether the new distillery on the North End is going to bring down property values in the neighborhood. They argue the way people who live in close proximity and have strong opinions and nowhere else to take them have always argued, loudly, specifically, with a great deal of personal investment in positions that are sometimes less about principle than about the pleasure of being right. The women are not in the taverns. This is one of the clearest lines in 1720s Boston's social geography. The tavern is a male space, or at least a predominantly male space during the evening hours, though women run them and serve in them, and are certainly present as workers, if not always as customers.
Women's social life happens in different spaces: in the kitchen while the washing is on, in the church after Sunday services, in the spinning bees and quilting gatherings, and the informal networks of neighborhood visiting that are the female equivalent of the tavern's male sociability. These networks are less visible in the historical record because the historical record in 1720s Boston is made almost entirely by men and concerns itself primarily with the things men do in public spaces. But they are real and they matter, and the information and support and community that flow through them are as important to the functioning of this city as anything that happens over a tankard of rum at the Green Dragon. There is one more thing the taverns are in 1720s Boston that is worth naming clearly. They are warm. This sounds trivial until you remember that warmth in this city, in this era, is not a given. It is something you have to produce and maintain and pay for, and the cost, in firewood, in labor, in time, is real. A tavern with a good fire going is a refuge in a way that nothing in modern experience quite replicates, because in modern experience you are almost never genuinely cold in a public space. In 1720s Boston, you can be genuinely cold almost anywhere, on the street, in your workplace, in your own home if the fire has gone low and you haven't noticed. The tavern's fire is not just pleasant, it is one of the reasons people are there. And so they sit, these Boston men of 1723, the fishermen and the craftsmen and the merchants and the sailors and the occasional Harvard graduate who has ended up here by some trajectory that would take too long to explain. They sit around their fires in their low-ceilinged, smoky, noisy, warm rooms, and they talk. They talk about the world as they understand it, and the world as they wish it were, and they have no idea, none of them, not a single one, that the things they are arguing about tonight are going to matter in ways they can possibly imagine, that the habits of mind they are building in these conversations, the insistence on having a voice, the resistance to authority they consider illegitimate, the conviction that a man has a right to say what he thinks and to have those thoughts taken seriously, are going to be exactly the habits of mind that 50 years from now make a revolution possible. They just think they're having a drink. The afternoon light in Boston in the 1720s is something you learn to pay attention to in a way that modern life has made almost completely unnecessary. There are no electric lights waiting to take over when the sun goes down. There are no bright overhead fixtures that make 3 in the afternoon and 11 at night functionally indistinguishable from each other. When the light goes, and what replaces it is expensive, limited, and nowhere near as good. So people watch the sky the way they watch a clock, because in a very real sense, it is the clock. And the angle of the winter sun over the rooftops of Boston tells you things you need to know about how much time you have left to get done what needs getting done. Candles are the primary solution to darkness in a 1720s Boston household, and they are made from one of two things, tallow or bayberry wax, and the difference between them matters more than you might think. Tallow is rendered animal fat, usually beef or mutton, and it is cheap and widely available because it is essentially a byproduct of the meat that people are already eating and the animals they are already keeping. The problem with tallow candles is that they smell, not terribly, not in a way that makes a room uninhabitable, but in a way that you would notice immediately if you walked into a room lit by them after a lifetime of electric lights. There is something slightly animal about the smell, slightly greasy, and the flame is steadier and wavery and produces a thin thread of dark smoke that, over the course of an evening, gives the low ceilings of Boston's wooden houses a faint gray cast that accumulates over years into something more permanent. Bayberry candles are better in almost every way. They burn cleaner. They smell pleasant. A mild, slightly sweet, distinctly New England smell that anyone who has ever burned a bayberry candle at Christmas in the modern world will recognize immediately, because that tradition comes directly from this era. The flame is steadier and brighter. The problem is that making bayberry candles is enormously labor-intensive because the wax has to be harvested from the small gray berries of the bayberry shrub by boiling vast quantities of them and skimming the wax off the surface of the water, a process that produces a surprisingly small amount of wax from a surprisingly large amount of berries. Martha makes bayberry candles in the autumn when the berries are ripe, and it takes the better part of 2 full days to produce enough to last the household through the winter, and she uses them carefully, reserving them for the evenings when she needs to do close work, sewing, mending, reading, rather than burning them for the mere luxury of better light. The candle making itself is a whole production. She melts the wax or tallow in a large pot over the fire, then dips the wicks, twisted cotton or linen threads, repeatedly into the liquid, hanging them on a rack between dips to cool and harden, building up layer by layer over the course of several hours until each candle reaches the right thickness. It is slow, meditative work, and Martha does it with the particular quality of attention that the people of this era bring to tasks that have to be done right because there is no easy way to fix them if they go wrong. A candle that is too thin burns out too fast. A wick that is off-center burns unevenly. Small things, but they matter when candles are something you make yourself and use carefully and cannot simply replace by walking to a store. The household also uses whale oil lamps, simple devices with a reservoir for the oil and a wick threaded through a metal spout, which are becoming more common in Boston's working households during the 1720s as the whaling industry based down the coast in Nantucket grows and whale oil becomes more available and more affordable. Whale oil burns cleaner than tallow and gives a steadier light, and a lamp gives more light than a candle for the same amount of fuel. In the wealthiest Boston households, there are elaborate imported brass lamp fixtures that hold multiple wicks and cast a warm golden light across rooms furnished with polished wood and fine imported fabrics, and the painted portraits of ancestors who stare down from the walls with the slightly stern expressions of people who took themselves very seriously and would like you to do the same. But the afternoon is not yet over, and there is still work to be done in the daylight while it lasts. The craftsmen of Boston, the carpenters and blacksmiths and shoemakers and tailors are in their shops, making the most of the remaining hours of natural light that allows them to do the fine work that candlelight makes difficult or impossible. The blacksmith's shop is the loudest place in any Boston neighborhood. The ringing of hammer on anvil is a sound that carries for blocks, a rhythmic metallic clanging that punctuates the afternoon, the way church bells punctuate the morning. Inside, the forge glows orange in the dim interior, and the smith, his face reddened by the heat, his arms heavy with the muscle that years of this work builds whether you want it to or not, shapes iron into the things that a wooden city constantly needs. Nails above all, the nails that hold every building in Boston together, that have to be made one by hand because there are no nail factories in 1723, no machines that stamp them out by the thousand. Nails are so valuable in this era that when a building is torn down, people save the nails. They pull them out carefully, straighten the bent ones, and store them to use again, because nails are not disposable objects. They are made things, each one representing a small but real investment of skilled labor. The tailors working in their shops this afternoon are producing the clothing that everyone in Boston wears, and the clothing of the 1720s is worth describing in some detail because it is so different from modern dress, not just in style, but in the materials, the construction, the way it relates to the body, and what it signals about the person wearing it. Boston in 1723 is a society where clothing communicates your status, your occupation, your religious community, and your self-understanding in ways that are instantly readable to everyone around you. You cannot walk down King Street without a knowledgeable observer being able to tell, at a glance, a great deal about who you are and where you stand in the social order. Wealthy men in 1720s Boston dress in ways that are, by modern standards, almost theatrically elaborate. A prosperous merchant or lawyer out in public wears a linen shirt next to the skin, changed more often than the outer garments, because linen is understood to absorb the body's perspiration and protect the more expensive outer layers from direct contact with the skin. Covered by a wool coat and waistcoat in fashionable colors, knee breeches buckled below the knee, silk or wool stockings and leather shoes with buckles that might be silver if he can afford them, brass if he cannot. He wears a wig, hair powdered white or gray, because wigs are fashionable and expensive, and therefore an excellent way of communicating that you can afford fashionable and expensive things. He carries a hat. Everything about his appearance is deliberate because in a society without business cards or LinkedIn profiles or any of the other mechanisms we use to signal our professional and social identities, your clothing is doing significant communicative work on your behalf every time you appear in public. Working men dress more practically. Ezekiel, when he is not on the water, wears wool, a plain coat and breeches in a dark, serviceable color that doesn't show dirt too readily, heavy stockings, sturdy leather shoes resoled so many times that the uppers and the soles have almost no original connection left. His clothes were mostly made by Martha, from fabric she either wove herself or bought from the dry goods shop, cut and sewn with the competent practicality of a woman who learned to sew as a girl and has been doing it every day since. There is nothing decorative about his clothing. Everything it does is functional: warmth, protection from the weather, coverage. But it is clean, or as clean as washing day can make it, and it is maintained and mended carefully, because new cloth costs money, and a coat that can be patched is a coat that doesn't need replacing. Martha herself wears a linen shift next to the skin, covered by a wool petticoat and a wool skirt, with a linen cap covering her hair, because respectable women in 1720s Boston do not appear in public with their hair uncovered, which is one of those social rules so fundamental to the culture that violating it would mark you immediately as either a woman of very low status or a woman who has temporarily lost her mind. Over everything, she wears a large apron that covers the front of her skirt because her work is messy and fabric is expensive, and the apron can be taken off and washed more easily than the skirt beneath it. She is, in her own way, dressed as deliberately as the merchant in his wig, her clothing communicating exactly what it needs to communicate about who she is and what her day consists of and what kind of woman she intends to be understood as. The afternoon moves toward evening with the particular quality of late winter light, that cold, flat, early fading brightness that people who have lived through New England winters know in their bones. By 4 o'clock, the light is already going. By 5, it is dark enough that the candles need to be lit. Martha lights the tallow candles for the keeping room and saves the bayberry for her sewing later, and the house settles into its evening rhythm, the fire built up a little higher against the coming cold of the night, the children gathering around it, the smell of whatever is in the pot over the hearth beginning to fill the room with something warm and savory, and the long, quiet hours of the Boston evening beginning to open up around the small, bright circle of the family's fire. Ezekiel comes home in the late afternoon, smelling of fish and cold, salt air, and the particular exhaustion of a man who has been doing hard physical work in the cold since before dawn. He doesn't say much when he comes in. He doesn't need to. Martha has been married to him long enough that she can read his day in the way he moves, whether the catch was good or poor, whether something went wrong on the water, whether he's tired in the ordinary way or tired in the deeper way that means something is weighing on him that he hasn't found the words for yet. She hands him a mug of something warm. He sits in his chair near the fire. The children climb on him for approximately 30 seconds before they are gently redirected towards something else, because a man who has been hauling nets in freezing water since 4 in the morning has earned a few minutes of sitting still before the evening begins in earnest. This is the domestic life of 1720s Boston at its most ordinary and most real. Not dramatic, not historically significant in any obvious way, just a man coming home to a warm room after a hard day, and a woman who has managed everything in his absence and will continue managing it for the rest of the evening, and children who are mostly healthy and mostly fed and mostly not in immediate danger, which on any given day in 1723 is about as much as any Boston parent dares to hope for. The evening meal, called supper, and it is the smaller meal of the day, not the larger one, which is dinner at midday, is whatever Martha has had simmering over the fire since this afternoon. Tonight it might be a thick pottage of salt pork and dried beans and whatever root vegetables came cheapest at the market this week, seasoned with dried herbs from last summer's garden, thyme, maybe, or sage, or the dried leaves of whatever grew most reliably in the small kitchen garden behind the house. There is bread. There is always bread if Martha has managed her baking schedule, which she almost always has, because running out of bread in a household with children is the kind of practical failure that she simply does not allow herself. The bread is dense and slightly coarse, made from a mixture of wheat and cornmeal, because pure wheat flour is more expensive than most working families use every day, and it is good, genuinely good, the way simple food made with care and eaten when you are actually hungry is always good in a way that more elaborate food rarely manages. The family eats together at the table in the keeping room. There are no individual place settings in the modern sense, no separate plates for each person necessarily, though some households had them by the 1720s. More commonly, there is a shared trencher, or a few large bowls from which everyone serves themselves, and the eating is done with spoons and fingers and the occasional knife, but no forks, because forks are still considered a somewhat affected luxury in working Boston households of this era. Table manners exist. There are rules about not reaching across others and not taking more than your share and not making noise while you eat. But they are the practical manners of people eating together in a small space, not the elaborate ritual of a formal dinner party. After supper, the children are the first order of business. The younger ones need to be prepared for bed, which is its own small production, the chamber pot retrieved from beneath the bed frame, the night clothes put on in the cold of the upstairs chamber, the bed warmer, a long-handled pan filled with hot coals from the fire, run between the sheets to take the worst of the chill off before the children climb in. The bedroom upstairs is cold in a way that is genuinely difficult for modern people to imagine. There is no heat source in this room except what drifts up from the chimney below, and on a January night in Boston, with the wind coming off the harbor, the temperature in that sleeping chamber can drop close to freezing. The children sleep close together under heavy wool blankets, their breath visible in the cold air, and they have learned from their earliest years that this is simply how nights are, that the transition from the warm keeping room to the cold, dark bedroom is one of the regular facts of existence, to be gotten through quickly and without fuss. The beds themselves are worth a moment of description, because sleeping in 1720s Boston is a more complicated and physical business than modern people realize. The mattress, if you are fortunate enough to have a proper one, is stuffed with whatever the household can afford. The finest mattresses in Boston's wealthiest homes are filled with goose down, covered in fine linen ticking, layered under blankets of soft wool and sheets that have been washed and pressed smooth with a flat iron heated directly in the fire. But in a household like Martha and Ezekiel's, the mattress is more likely stuffed with a combination of corn husks and wool scraps, and perhaps some cattail fluff gathered from the marshes at the edge of the city, materials that are cheap and locally available, but that flatten quickly under use and need to be refreshed every season and provide a sleeping surface that is serviceable rather than luxurious. The mattress rests on a wooden bed frame strung across with a web of ropes, and those ropes stretch and sag over time under the weight of the sleeper, creating a hammock-like depression that shifts your body into positions that are not ideal for a good night's rest. Tightening the ropes is a regular household maintenance task, done with a wooden peg, pulling each rope snug, and it is the literal origin of the phrase "sleep tight" that you have probably said or heard 1,000 times without ever thinking about where it came from. Someone in a house very much like this one, 300 years ago, reminded their child to check the bed ropes before settling in for the night. And somehow those two words survived everything that happened between then and now, and are still in your language, worn smooth with use, their original meaning long forgotten. While the children sleep, the keeping room downstairs settles into its evening quiet. Ezekiel might read. He is literate, one of the genuinely remarkable features of 1720s New England compared to most of the world at this time, a consequence of the Puritan community's deep investment in education as a religious necessity. He might read the Bible, or a religious pamphlet, or the weekly newspaper if it is a week when they have managed to obtain a copy. He might simply sit by the fire in the particular stillness of a man who has used his body hard all day and is grateful to have nothing required of him for a few hours. He might talk with Martha in the low, familiar way of two people who have been sharing a life long enough that conversation between them is less an exchange of new information than a kind of companionable maintenance of the connection between them, a checking in, a touching base, a quiet confirmation that they are still here, still together, still managing. Martha, meanwhile, is never simply sitting. Her hands are always doing something. This is not restlessness. It is the deep habit of a woman who has internalized so thoroughly the ethic of productive labor that idleness feels not just wasteful, but physically uncomfortable. Tonight, her hands are knitting, working a pair of wool stockings on wooden needles by the firelight, her fingers moving through the familiar sequence of stitches without conscious thought, the wool pulling smoothly from the ball in her lap, while her mind ranges freely over the day's events and tomorrow's requirements, and the particular low-level worry about Samuel's cough that has been present in the back of her mind since yesterday morning. The worry about illness is never far from the surface in a household with children in 1720s Boston. It sits quietly in the background of every ordinary day, dormant most of the time, but always present, the awareness that a cough can become a fever, and a fever can become something that the herbs in the kitchen garden cannot touch, something that requires the doctor and costs money they don't entirely have, or worse, something that requires nothing at all because it moves faster than any intervention can follow. Martha has lost a child before. She knows what that looks like from the beginning, the particular quality of a fever that is different from an ordinary fever, the way a child's eyes go when something serious is happening. She does not let herself think about it directly, but it informs everything, the careful attention she pays to the children's health, the immediate response to any symptom that seems out of the ordinary, the quiet prayers she says every morning that are as much practical petition as theological exercise. Outside, Boston has gone quiet. The streets that were busy all day are mostly empty now, the cobblestones slick with cold, the narrow alleys between buildings dark in a way that is genuinely dark, not the attenuated darkness of a modern city where the sky itself is lit from below, but real darkness, the kind where you cannot see your hand in front of your face without a lantern. The night watch is out there somewhere, two men moving slowly through the empty streets with a lantern and a wooden rattle, looking for fires and trouble, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. A dog barks somewhere in the distance, a ship in the harbor creaks against its moorings, and the city of Boston, 12,000 souls packed onto their small peninsula, turns over in its cold beds and sleeps. The night watch is one of those institutions that tells you something essential about how a community understands itself, what it is afraid of, what it values, how it organizes collective responsibility when the formal structures of government are thin and the distance between order and chaos is shorter than anyone likes to admit. Boston in 1723 had no police force. There are constables, appointed by the town, who handle specific legal matters, serving warrants, collecting fines, managing the occasional arrest. There are justices of the peace who hear minor cases and dispense summary judgments on small disputes and petty crimes. But there is nothing like what we would recognize as a professional law enforcement agency, no uniformed officers whose job it is to patrol the streets and prevent crime as a continuous, organized activity. What there is the watch, and the watch is, to put it plainly, a group of ordinary men doing their civic duty in the dark, armed with a lantern and a wooden rattle and whatever personal authority they can project, which varies considerably depending on the individual man and the situation he finds himself in. In the earlier decades of the colony, service on the watch was essentially mandatory for male residents, a communal obligation like jury duty that came with being part of the community. By the 1720s, it has evolved into something more informal, and increasingly it is possible for men who can afford it to pay a substitute to serve in their place. This means the watch is gradually filling up with men who are poor enough that a few pennies for a night's work is worth walking cold streets until dawn, which is not necessarily a recipe for the most rigorous law enforcement. What the watch is genuinely good at, what it was designed for, and what it does with real effectiveness is fire detection. And fire is not an abstract risk in Boston in 1723. Fire is the thing that everyone in this city fears above almost everything else, because Boston is a city made of wood, and the conditions for catastrophic fire are present every single night. Every house has multiple open flames burning in it. The houses are packed close together, often sharing walls. The streets between them are narrow enough that fire jumping from one roofline to the next is not a question of weather, but of how fast. And the firefighting equipment available in the 1720s, hand-pumped leather engines that require a chain of men passing buckets from the nearest water source, is barely adequate under the best conditions and completely overwhelmed by anything more than a modest blaze. Boston has burned before, and the memory of it is physically present in the city. The Great Fire of 1711 destroyed more than 100 buildings in the heart of town, including the original townhouse at the head of King Street, and the rebuilt townhouse, completed in 1713 in red brick, a deliberate statement of permanence and of the desire to not go through that again, still stands, fresh enough that the men who helped rebuild it are not old. The ruins of other fires are visible here and there in the city's fabric, empty lots where buildings haven't been replaced, or new constructions sitting slightly awkwardly next to older structures, the seams of the city's trauma still visible if you know how to look. This is why when the watch smells smoke in the night, the response is immediate and serious. The wooden rattle that each watchman carries is not for criminals, it is a fire alarm, a device that makes an enormous clatter when swung in a circle and that can be heard from a significant distance on a quiet night. When a watchman spots a fire or smells smoke, he starts rattling and he doesn't stop, and the sound travels through the sleeping city and brings people out of their houses and out of their beds with a speed that reflects how deeply the fear of fire lives in every Boston resident's body. The volunteer fire companies that exist in the city by the 1720s, groups of citizens who have organized themselves, pooled their resources to buy equipment, and committed to responding to any alarm, turn out in the middle of the night with a reliability that speaks to the absolute seriousness with which this threat is taken. The irony is that the very thing that makes Boston so vulnerable to fire, its wooden construction, its density, its reliance on open flame for every domestic need, is also what makes it the city it is. Wood is what the forests of New England produce in abundance. Wood is what local craftsmen know how to work. Wood is cheap enough that ordinary working families can afford houses built from it, which means Boston is a city where a fisherman and his wife can own, or at least rent, a real house with multiple rooms and a proper hearth, rather than living in the kind of crowded, single-room tenement poverty that characterizes the urban poor in many European cities of the same era. The vulnerability and the relative comfort are the same thing, seen from different angles. Now, while the watch patrols the dark streets and the city sleeps, let us talk about the thing that is keeping Boston up at night in a different sense. The thing that is in every conversation, in every tavern argument, in every anxious discussion between neighbors. The thing that happened just 2 years ago and that has left marks on almost every face in this city, literally and figuratively. Smallpox. The epidemic of 1721 hit Boston like a wall. It arrived on a ship from the Caribbean in April of that year, disease traveling the same trade routes as molasses and rum and dried fish, invisible cargo in the hold of a vessel that looked perfectly ordinary pulling into the harbor on a spring morning. Within weeks, it was spreading through the city with the speed and indiscriminateness that made smallpox one of the most feared diseases in the history of the world. By the time it was over, more than half of Boston's 12,000 residents had been infected. Nearly 900 people had died. The characteristic marks it left on survivors, the pitted scars, the pocked skin, the occasional blindness, are visible on faces all over the city in 1723, 2 years later. Permanent reminders written on human skin of what the city went through. But the epidemic of 1721 is also the occasion for something that will eventually be recognized as one of the most important medical events in American colonial history. And it starts in an unlikely place, in a conversation between a minister and an enslaved man. Cotton Mather is, by 1721, one of the most famous and most complicated men in Boston. He has been a minister at the Old North Church for decades. He has published hundreds of books and pamphlets. He has corresponded with scientists across the Atlantic world. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of London, the most prestigious scientific organization in the English-speaking world, an honor he takes with the complete seriousness of a man who genuinely believes that understanding the natural world is a form of understanding God's creation. He is brilliant and learned and genuinely concerned with the welfare of his community. He is also the man whose theological framework provided intellectual support for the Salem witch trials 30 years earlier, and that history follows him like a shadow, coloring everything he does with a complicated mixture of admiration and suspicion. In the years before the epidemic, Mather had read a paper in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society describing a practice common in Turkey and the Middle East, deliberately introducing a small amount of material from a smallpox pustule into a healthy person through a small cut in the skin in order to provoke a mild infection that would confer immunity against the more severe natural disease. This was inoculation, a practice that the Western medical establishment was just beginning to take seriously, and that Mather found immediately compelling on both scientific and theological grounds. But what makes the story remarkable, what gives it a dimension that history has been slow to fully acknowledge, is that Mather had already heard about this practice from a source closer to home. Onesimus was an enslaved African man living in Mather's own household, and he had told his enslaver years earlier that he had been inoculated against smallpox in Africa as a child. He showed Mather the scar. He described the procedure. He explained that the practice was common in his homeland, and that people who underwent it were protected against the disease. Mather listened. He wrote about the conversation in his diary. And when the epidemic arrived in 1721 and the city began to fill with the sick and the dying, he remembered what Onesimus had told him, and he acted on it. He persuaded a physician named Zabdiel Boylston to begin inoculating willing Bostonians. The results were striking. Inoculated people were far less likely to die than those who caught smallpox naturally, a difference dramatic enough to be visible even without the statistical tools that modern medicine would bring to the analysis. The practice worked. The evidence was there for anyone willing to look at it honestly. The response of Boston's medical and civic community to this evidence is a lesson in how innovation is always received in every era. The opposition was immediate and furious. Most of the city's other physicians, led by a formally trained Scottish doctor named William Douglas, who had the only genuine medical degree in the colony, denounced inoculation as dangerous quackery. The newspapers took up the attack with enthusiasm. The New England Courant, James Franklin's paper, where young Benjamin was setting type, published letter after letter against Mather and Boylston, casting the practice as both medically reckless and theologically presumptuous. Someone threw a crude bomb through Mather's window with a threatening note attached. The bomb failed to explode. Mather survived, and the data from Boylston's inoculations kept accumulating, each number in the ledger a quiet argument that something important was being demonstrated here, something that the loudest voices of opposition could not actually refute with evidence, because the evidence was going the other direction. By 1723, the immediate crisis was over. The epidemic has passed. The city is rebuilding itself, not its buildings, which survived, but its sense of safety, its ordinary daily confidence that tomorrow will come and will roughly resemble today, which is the psychological foundation that a serious epidemic dismantles in ways that take longer to repair than anything physical. People who lived through the worst of 1721, who nursed sick children, who watched neighbors die, who woke every morning checking their own skin for the first signs of the distinctive rash, carry the memory in their bodies in a way that does not simply go away when the epidemic ends. And yet, Boston in 1723 is not a traumatized city in any simple sense. It is a city that has been through something terrible and come out the other side still standing, still working, still arguing about everything, still building new wharves and new houses and new businesses, still printing newspapers and training apprentices and sending ships out into the Atlantic. There is a resilience here that is partly temperamental, the Puritan inheritance of facing hardship without self-pity, and partly simply the resilience of people who have no alternative to continuing, because the work does not stop, and the children do not stop needing to be fed, and the fire does not stop needing to be maintained, and so you continue, because continuing is what you do. That resilience, that stubborn forward motion in the face of everything the world can throw at you, it is, perhaps, the most characteristically Boston thing about 1720s Boston. And it is, if you look carefully, a through line connecting this city in 1723 to the city it will become, the city that 50 years from now will look at the most powerful empire in the world and say, quietly, and then louder, and then in a voice that carries across centuries, no, not this, not anymore. Let us talk about Sunday. Because Sunday in 1720s Boston is unlike any other day of the week. And understanding what Sunday looks and feels and sounds like in this city tells you more about who these people are, what they believe, what they fear, what gives their lives meaning and structure, than almost anything else you could observe about them. Sunday begins the same way every other day begins, in the cold and the dark, with the fire needing to be rebuilt, and the water needing to be fetched, and the children needing to be fed. These things do not pause for the Sabbath. The physical requirements of staying alive in a New England winter do not recognize the theological significance of the day. But everything else, every optional activity, every form of work that is not strictly necessary for survival, every social gathering that is not specifically religious, stops completely. This is not a suggestion. This is a rule enforced by social pressure so overwhelming that it functions almost as effectively as law, and in some cases actually is law, because Massachusetts in the 1720s still has statutes on the books that prohibit unnecessary work and travel and commerce on the Lord's Day. And while enforcement is inconsistent, the community's collective disapproval of Sabbath breaking is something that most people are not willing to risk. So the family dresses, more carefully than on weekdays, in the best clothes they own, because appearing at meeting in shabby or dirty clothing is a statement you do not want to make about yourself or your household. And they walk to the meeting house. In winter, this walk is done quickly, heads down against the cold, the children urged along with the particular mixture of encouragement and mild threat that parents have always used to get children moving in the morning. The meeting house is not a cathedral. It is not a building designed to overwhelm you with its beauty or its scale. It is a plain, functional structure, large enough to hold the congregation, heated inadequately by a small stove or two that take the worst of the edge off the cold, but do not, in January, make the interior what any reasonable person would call warm. The pews are wooden and hard. The windows are small. There are no candles burning for atmosphere. Candles in the meeting house are for light, not decoration, and on a Sunday morning in winter there is enough gray daylight coming through the small windows that candles are not needed. The congregation assembles with a combination of genuine devotion and the particular social alertness of people who know that everyone in the room is watching everyone else. Where you sit in the meeting house matters. The seating is organized by social rank, with the most prominent families in the best pews closest to the pulpit. And the arrangement is not random or self-selected, but assigned by the town's pew committee, which is one of the more socially delicate administrative tasks in 1720s Boston, because it requires ranking every family in the congregation by their relative standing, which is a judgment that offends almost everyone it touches in some way. Martha and Ezekiel sit in the middle section, which is where they belong by the standards of their community, not at the front with the merchants and the Harvard men, not at the back with the very poor and the servants, but solidly in the middle, which is where most of Boston actually is. The minister enters, the congregation stands, and then the sermon begins, and it does not stop for a very long time. Preaching in 1720s Boston is an art form, and the ministers who practice it are the most publicly prominent performers in the city, more famous and more carefully attended to than any actor or musician, more influential in the daily thinking of their congregations than any politician, more deeply known and more intimately trusted than anyone outside the family. A good Boston minister preaches for 2 to 3 hours without notes, from memory, drawing on a lifetime of reading and study and pastoral experience, weaving together biblical exegesis and theological argument and pointed commentary on the moral state of the congregation and the wider world into something that is simultaneously a lecture and a drama and a communal ritual. The congregation sits and listens, and their listening is not passive. They are engaged, thinking, measuring what they hear against their own experience and their own understanding of Scripture, ready to discuss and debate what was said for the rest of the week. The theology being preached in Boston's Congregationalist meeting houses in 1720s Boston is a somewhat evolved version of the strict Calvinist Puritanism that the founders brought with them from England a century earlier. Some of the harder edges have softened over time, the absolute predestinationism that left no room for human agency in the matter of salvation, the fierce suspicion of any religious practice that might be mistaken for the corrupt ceremonialism of the Church of England. But the core commitments remain. These are people who believe that the universe was created by a personal God who takes an active interest in human affairs, that human beings are fallen creatures capable of redemption only through divine grace, that this life is a preparation for an eternal life that will make its hardships seem trivial in retrospect, and that the community they live in has a collective covenant with God that makes their shared moral behavior everyone's business and everyone's responsibility. That last conviction, the idea of collective covenant, collective moral responsibility, has enormous practical consequences for daily life in Boston. It means that your neighbor's behavior is not simply their own affair. It means that the community's prosperity or suffering is understood as a reflection of its collective faithfulness or faithlessness. When a fire destroys a block of houses, or a smallpox epidemic sweeps through the city, or a series of bad fishing seasons leaves the waterfront families struggling, the theological framework of 1720s Boston requires the community to ask, what have we done collectively to bring this upon ourselves? What sin, what faithlessness, what departure from the covenant has made us vulnerable to this suffering? This is not a comfortable way of understanding disaster, and it can lead to some profoundly unjust conclusions about the people who suffer most. But it is also, in its way, a form of collective accountability, a refusal to accept that what happens to the most vulnerable members of the community is simply their problem and no one else's. After the morning service, there is a break. Enough time to go home, eat the cold dinner that was prepared the day before, because cooking on Sunday is the kind of unnecessary work the Sabbath prohibits, and then return for the afternoon service, which is shorter than the morning, but still substantial. By the time Sunday's fully over, the average Boston family has spent 4 to 5 hours in the meeting house, which is an enormous investment of time and physical endurance in an uncomfortable wooden pew in a cold building, and which tells you something important about the seriousness with which this community takes its religious obligations. The social life that clusters around the meeting house, the conversations on the steps before and after the service, the catching up with neighbors you haven't seen since last Sunday, the quiet exchange of information and concern and community solidarity is as important as the service itself in practical terms. This is where Martha finds out that a neighbor's child has been sick and learns what remedies the mother has tried. This is where Ezekiel hears from another fisherman that the fish have been running better north of the harbor this week. This is where the threads of community connection are regularly renewed and maintained, where people who live in close physical proximity, but whose daily work keeps them largely separate from each other, are reminded that they are part of something larger than their individual households. The children, for their part, experience Sunday with the mixture of genuine engagement and restless endurance that children bring to all long obligatory activities. They have been taught the catechism, the set of questions and answers that lay out the basic theological framework of their faith, memorized word for word, and they can recite it when required, which in a 1720s Boston household means they can be required to recite it at almost any moment and had better be ready. They understand, in the way that children absorb the fundamental assumptions of the world they grow up in, that the God being discussed in the meeting house is not a distant or abstract figure, but a present and attentive one, watching, judging, caring about what they do and what they fail to do, interested in them specifically and personally in a way that is simultaneously comforting and unnerving. Samuel, the 9-year-old, is at the age where this theological framework is becoming something he actively thinks about, rather than simply accepting as the water he swims in. He has questions, the kind of questions that children ask when they are intelligent enough to notice the places where the official story doesn't quite add up, but not yet old enough to have developed the adult capacity for comfortable ambiguity that allows most people to live with unanswered questions indefinitely. Why does God allow suffering if He is good and powerful? Why do some people die young and others live to be old? Why did the smallpox take the minister's daughter and spare the sailor who everyone knows drinks too much and behaves badly? His father answers these questions as best he can with the theological vocabulary available to him, which is considerable. Ezekiel is a literate lad in a community that takes literacy seriously, and he has read more of the Bible than most modern Christians have. But some of the questions do not have answers that fully satisfy, and Samuel knows it, and Ezekiel knows that Samuel knows it, and the conversation between them has that particular quality of honesty that exists between a parent and a child when both of them are dealing with something genuinely difficult and neither of them is pretending otherwise. This is one of the things about 1720s Boston that is easy to miss if you are not paying attention. The intellectual seriousness of ordinary people. These are not simple folk. They are not credulous peasants accepting whatever the authorities tell them without question. They read, they argue, they think carefully about complicated things. They apply critical intelligence to questions of theology and politics and medicine and commerce with a rigor that would surprise anyone who assumes that people in the past were less thoughtful than people now. The Boston of 1723 is in fact one of the most intellectually lively places in the entire world at this moment. A small city on the edge of a continent, buzzing with argument and debate and the kind of restless questioning that eventually produces revolutions. You can hear it in the taverns, you can see it in the newspapers, you can find it in the meeting house, where the congregation is not simply receiving the minister's word, but measuring it,
testing it, taking it home and turning it over, and coming back next Sunday ready to hear more. And you can find it, perhaps most movingly, in the conversations between a fisherman and his 9-year-old son, sitting by a fire on a Sunday evening in 1723, trying honestly to make sense of a world that does not always make sense, which is, when you think about it, exactly what human beings have always done, in every time and every place, and exactly what connects us to them. 300 years of everything that has changed.
Let us spend some time at the waterfront, because we have been inside long enough. Inside houses and meeting houses and taverns and print shops. And Boston's waterfront is the place where everything this city actually is becomes visible all at once, laid out in front of you with a directness that the more respectable neighborhoods deliberately avoid. If the meeting house is the soul of 1720s Boston, the waterfront is its body. Loud, physical, smelling of things you would rather not identify. Absolutely essential and impossible to look away from. Long Wharf stretches out into the harbor like an arm reaching for something, nearly half a mile of timber and stone, wide enough for 2 loaded carts to pass each other without either driver having to pull over and wait, lined along one side with warehouses and counting houses and ship chandlers' shops where you can buy anything a vessel needs to go to sea. It was completed in 1713, just 10 years ago, and it is still one of the most impressive structures in colonial America, a statement in wood and stone and sheer human effort of how seriously Boston takes its identity as a commercial city, a city whose prosperity flows in through this harbor and must be accommodated with the best infrastructure the colony can build. Standing at the head of Long Wharf on a clear morning in 1723 and looking out toward the harbor is one of those experiences that would stop you in your tracks even now, 300 years later, if you could somehow be transported there. The harbor is full of ships, not a few ships, many ships, their masts rising above the water in what looks from a distance like a leafless winter forest growing improbably from the surface of the sea. Brigs and schooners and sloops, and the occasional large square-rigged merchant vessel that has come from somewhere farther away than the coastal trade normally reaches, from London, perhaps, or from Lisbon, or from the Caribbean islands that are Boston's most important trading partners and its most morally compromised ones. Each of these vessels is a world unto itself, self-contained and complete, carrying within its wooden hull a cargo and a crew and a history that could fill its own long story. The sounds at the waterfront are overwhelming in a way that is hard to prepare for if you have spent the morning in the quieter residential streets of the city. The creak and groan of wooden hulls against the dock pilings, a deep rhythmic sound like the city itself is breathing, the slap of water against stone, the shouts of sailors and dock workers in what sounds like several languages at once, because it is several languages at once, English in various accents, some Portuguese, some Dutch, the occasional burst of something from further away that nobody on the dock can quite identify. The rumble of heavy barrels being rolled across the wharf planking, barrels of molasses, barrels of saltfish, barrels of rum, barrels of pitch, and all the other materials that keep the maritime economy moving. Overhead, the gulls are always there, wheeling and crying with a persistence that makes them feel less like birds and more like a permanent weather condition. The dock workers who move this cargo are doing some of the hardest physical labor in a city full of hard physical labor. moving barrels of molasses, each one weighing several hundred pounds, across a wharf and into a warehouse and then out again onto a cart, requires a combination of technique and brute strength that takes years to develop and that wears the body down in specific ways. The dock workers of Boston in 1723 are, on average, shorter-lived than even the fishermen, their bodies broken down by the cumulative impact of decades of this work in the cold and the wet. They are paid by the day, which means they have no work and no income on days when the weather is too bad for ships to come in or when the cargo simply does not materialize. They live close to the waterfront in the densest and most chaotic part of the city, in boarding houses and small rented rooms that are cheap because they are close to everything that makes the waterfront neighborhood loud and smelly and occasionally dangerous. Among the most interesting and least discussed inhabitants of this waterfront world are the free black men who work on the docks alongside their white counterparts. Boston in 1723 had a small but real population of free black residents, men and women who have been freed from enslavement by their enslavers, or who were born free, or who have purchased their own freedom through years of careful saving. The legal and social position of free black people in 1720s Boston is complicated in ways that resist simple summary. They are legally free, they can own property, sign contracts, appear in court. They worship in the same churches as white Bostonians, often in the same pews, though usually toward the back. Their children attend the same dame schools, learn the same catechism, and grow up speaking the same English. And yet the color of their skin marks them as different in the eyes of a community that has embedded racial hierarchy into its economic foundations so deeply that even people of genuine goodwill cannot always see it clearly enough to question it. The maritime world is one of the few spaces in 1720s Boston where the boundaries of race are somewhat more permeable than elsewhere. Ships need crew, and ships do not always have the luxury of being selective about who fills a berth when a voyage is about to depart. Free black men work as sailors, as dock workers, as rope makers and boat builders, and some of them rise to positions of genuine skill and modest authority within the maritime trades. It is not equality, it is nothing close to equality, but it is a degree of practical recognition based on demonstrated competence that the more respectable, more racially rigid spaces of colonial Boston do not always offer. The sailors themselves deserve more than the brief mention we have given them so far, because they are among the most fascinating people in the entire world of 1720s Boston, and among the least represented in the history books, which tend to focus on the merchants and the ministers and the politicians, while the men who actually moved the goods across the ocean remain largely nameless and unexamined. A common sailor in 1723 is typically young. The work destroys bodies too efficiently to sustain for long, and most men who go to sea either move up to officer positions or get off ships before middle age if they want to stay healthy. He is almost certainly not from Boston originally. He might be from any port city in the Atlantic world: London, Bristol, Cork, Amsterdam, Lisbon, Barbados, or a dozen smaller places whose names you would not recognize. He has been to places that the most well-traveled Boston merchant has only read about, has eaten food and heard music from cultures that most Bostonians cannot even picture, and he carries this breadth of experience in a way that makes him simultaneously the most cosmopolitan and the least respectable person in the city.
The life of a common sailor is hard enough that describing it accurately risks sounding like an exaggeration. The food aboard a merchant vessel in the 1720s is salt beef and hard biscuit, the biscuit so hard that new sailors sometimes chip teeth on it, and so reliably infested with weevils after a few weeks at sea that experienced sailors develop the habit of tapping the biscuit on the table before eating it to knock the weevils out, a practice they perform with the calm matter-of-factness of people who have made their peace with the realities of their situation. The sleeping quarters below deck are cramped beyond what most people would consider tolerable. Hammocks slung so close together that the men sleeping in them can feel each other breathing, in a space that is also used for storage and that smells of bilge water and tar and the accumulated sweat of men who have been at sea for weeks without any meaningful opportunity to wash. The work is physically dangerous in ways that are simply accepted as the cost of the profession. Men fall from rigging, are swept overboard by waves, are crushed by shifting cargo, and the sea does not give them back. And yet, men go to sea generation after generation in numbers that suggest the alternative, working on a dock or in a shop in Boston for wages that are not much better, in conditions that are not much safer, in a life that offers much less freedom and much less story, is not obviously preferable. A sailor, for all the hardship, is not stuck. He goes places. He sees things. He comes back to port with money in his pocket, sometimes quite a lot of money if the voyage was successful, and a week or two of freedom before the money runs out and the need for another berth reasserts itself. It is a life that trades security for motion, and there are always young men in any port city who are willing to make that trade. The ships they sail on are objects of genuine beauty, and this is too worth noting, that in the world of 1720s Boston, beauty and function are not separate categories in the way that modern industrial design often makes them. A well-built merchant vessel of this era is beautiful because it has been optimized through centuries of accumulated knowledge and continuous refinement for the specific task of moving through water efficiently and safely. And the process of optimizing something for its function, when done with sufficient skill and care over sufficient time, produces beauty as a byproduct. The hull lines of a Boston-built schooner in 1723, the curve of its bow and the elegant taper of its stern, the proportions of its masts and the geometry of its rigging, these are things that shipwrights have been thinking about and arguing about and refining for generations, and the result is something that any person with eyes can see is right, in the same way that a perfectly made chair or a perfectly thrown pot is right. The rightness of a thing that has found exactly the form it needed to find. Standing at the end of Long Wharf and watching one of these vessels move out of the harbor on an outgoing tide, its sails filling with the morning wind, getting smaller and smaller against the open water until it is just a shape on the horizon, and then nothing at all. This is one of the sights that Boston offers its residents every day, and it never entirely loses its power. It's a reminder of how big the world is and how connected this small city on its small peninsula is to that big world, and how much of what makes Boston what it is has traveled across enormous distances of water to get here. Everything comes from somewhere. Everything is connected to everything else, and the harbor, with its ships and its cargo and its sailors and its noise and its smell, is where that truth is most nakedly visible.
The day is ending. Not dramatically. There is no sunset visible from the narrow streets of the city, no clear moment when you can point to the sky and say, "There, that is where the day stopped and the night began." It just slowly gets darker and colder and quieter, and the people of Boston make their way back to their houses and their fires with the particular purposeful weariness of people who have used their day fully and completely and have nothing left to account for. Martha is at the hearth again. She is always at the hearth. This is not a complaint, it is simply the geography of her life, the fixed point around which everything else orbits. The fire that she rebuilt this morning before dawn is still going, fed and managed throughout the day with the continuous attention it requires, and it will be banked carefully tonight before she sleeps, the coals buried under ash to keep them alive through the cold hours until morning, when she will need to coax them back to flame, and the whole cycle will begin again. She has done this every day of her adult life. She will do it every day for the rest of it. And there is something in this, in the continuous, unbroken chain of tending that connects one morning to the next, that is, if you look at it right, a kind of profound and underappreciated art. The children are already in bed. Samuel went up quietly tonight, which means either that he is tired or that he has something on his mind that he is processing in the private way that thoughtful children process things, slowly, internally, arriving at conclusions in their own time. Martha noticed. She notices everything, which is one of the requirements of being the person that everyone in a household depends on. She will check on him in an hour, and if he is still awake, she will sit on the edge of his bed in the cold, dark room, and they will talk, quietly so as not to wake the younger ones, and whatever it is that is bothering him will either get said or it won't, and either way the sitting there will have mattered. Ezekiel is in his chair. He has eaten, and he is warm, and the day is done. And the particular quality of his stillness right now, the complete animal relaxation of a man whose body has been worked hard and is now being rested, is one of those things that Martha finds she is still capable of noticing after all these years, the way you notice a familiar piece of furniture that you have stopped consciously seeing, but that you would immediately miss if it were gone. He is reading, or he was reading. The book is open in his lap, but his eyes are closed, and in another few minutes he will be asleep in the chair, and Martha will have to decide whether to wake him and send him upstairs, or simply put a blanket over him and let him be. Outside, Boston is settling into its night. The sounds are changing, the daytime noise of commerce and labor giving way to the quieter sounds of evening. A few voices from a tavern somewhere nearby, muffled by the cold and the distance. The watch somewhere in the dark streets, their lantern casting a small moving circle of light across the cobblestones. A dog. The harbor, always the harbor, the water and the wind and the creak of ships, a sound so constant and so present that the people of this city have stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat, though it is there, underneath everything, all the time. It has been a long day. It has been a completely ordinary day, and I want to spend just a few more minutes with it before we let it go, because ordinary days in extraordinary times are the part of history that we most consistently fail to understand, and understanding them matters more than we usually acknowledge. The people of 1720s Boston are living at the beginning of something enormous. They do not know this. They cannot know this. The revolution is 50 years away. 50 years, which is a long lifetime for many of them, longer than some of them will live. The Declaration of Independence has not been written. The Constitution has not been imagined. The United States of America does not exist, and is not, as far as anyone in Boston in 1723 is consciously concerned, something that needs to exist.
These are British subjects, most of them proud of it, connected to London by ties of culture and commerce and law and sentiment that are real and strong and not something they're looking to cut. And yet the things that will make the revolution possible are already here, already present in the daily life of this city, already being built into the character of the community in ways that no one is planning and no one is directing. The habit of argument, the absolute refusal to accept authority on its own terms, the insistence on examining it and questioning it and deciding for yourself whether it is legitimate. This is being built every Sunday in the meeting houses, every evening in the taverns, every morning in the print shops, where men like James Franklin publish things that powerful people do not want published, because they believe, with a conviction that is entirely genuine and entirely Boston, that the public has a right to know. The habit of self-governance, the expectation that a man has a voice in the decisions that affect his life, that the community as a whole has a say in how it is ordered. This is being built every year in the town meetings, where fishermen and craftsmen and shopkeepers stand up and say what they think and vote on what they believe and hold their elected representatives accountable for what they do with the authority they have been given. Benjamin Franklin is going to leave Boston within the year. He is going to slip away on a ship to New York and make his way to Philadelphia and become, in the fullness of time, one of the most extraordinary human beings his century has produced. But he will carry Boston with him. The curiosity, the irreverence, the practical intelligence, the absolute democratic conviction that a man's worth is determined by what he does and not by who his father was. These are Boston things, formed in the air of this city and in the culture of its print shops and its taverns and its meeting houses, and they will be with him every day of his long and remarkable life. The boy named Samuel, Martha and Ezekiel's son, 9 years old, sitting in the dame's school this morning learning his letters from the New England Primer, will grow up in a Boston that is changing faster than any previous generation experienced, moving toward a confrontation with the mother country that will reshape the world. He will be a young man in his 30s when the revolution comes. Perhaps he will fight in it. Perhaps he will argue for it in a tavern or a meeting house. Perhaps he will simply live through it, doing what his father did and his grandfather before him, getting up before dawn, going out to do hard work in the cold, coming home to a warm fire and a family that needs him, and in that living, in that stubborn, unremarkable continuity, contributing something essential to the survival of everything that is being built here. And Martha, who has been on her feet since before dawn, who has fetched water and rebuilt a fire and made breakfast and done the washing and managed the children and cooked supper and will now sit up for another hour doing her mending by candlelight before she finally allows herself to sleep. Martha, whose name will not appear in any history book, whose thoughts and feelings and daily heroism are almost entirely unrecorded, whose life is the invisible foundation on which every more visible life in this household is built. She is what this city is made of at the deepest level. Not the merchants or the ministers or the politicians or the famous men whose names we still know. Her, the woman at the hearth, tending the fire that keeps everyone alive, doing the work that makes all the other work possible, carrying in her body and her hands and her quiet daily faithfulness the whole weight of everything that the word home actually means. She banks the fire carefully, the way she does every night, Coals buried under ash, the damper adjusted just so, the woodpile checked to make sure there is enough for the morning. She checks the children, all sleeping, Samuel curled on his side in the way he has slept since he was a baby, his breath slow and even in the cold air. She moves through the dark house with the confidence of someone who knows every board and every step and every creak by feel, who has lived in this space long enough that it is an extension of her own body. She gets into bed. The ropes are tight, the blankets are heavy and wool warm. Ezekiel is already there, having been gently redirected from his chair some time in the last hour, and the warmth of another body in the cold room is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything, the most basic and most ancient human comfort, the simple animal fact of not being alone in the dark. She closes her eyes. Outside, the harbor is quiet. The watch moves slowly through the empty streets. The ships rock gently at their moorings. And Boston, this small, cold, loud, brilliant, complicated, deeply human city, sleeps. Sleep well. You have been here with them, and now you know what it was like.